to see a show of hands. How many people in the audience are from a telco, i.e. telecommunications service provider? Okay. Equipment providers? Oh, brilliant. Customers who use both of those services. We have some. All right, cool. What I'd like to do today is just provoke some thought. And provoke some thought largely around what's the changing landscape for telcos, what are the things that we are facing as communication service providers, and how we're intending to deal with them and how other people around the world are dealing with them. And so when we look at what was presented in the morning, we're talking about the Internet of Things. So obviously the Internet is creating a platform which service providers and telcos are bringing to bear to allow many business models to change and evolve. But with that comes the context of big data. As that plethora of data becomes available, how do you take the data and analyze it such that you're looking at customer behavior, and creating strategies for you to continue to become and remain relevant to your target market? But then adding on the context of cognitive computing, and how do you actually start programming machines to start thinking like humans do? And how does that start creating an automation in the sense of ambient intelligence, which then says it's about creating an environment that senses the presence of people. And on the back of that, how do you create a services infrastructure that still delivers the services to customers? But at the core of it, you still have privacy issues, whether it's privacy issues related to the individual, the data that gets created, the analytics that are created, and how do you actually remain contextualize it? How do you contextualize the privacy element? So with all of these things happening around us, as service providers, we itself are being challenged. Everybody wants more for less or more for same. And at the same time, our own cost structures are starting to increase as well, and we have to manage the cost as well as driving the revenues up, which is not uncommon. But with all of this growth, the one thing is absolutely common is we know that bandwidth or capacity is the new gold, and in the context of Time magazine is the new black gold. Now with that, everybody wanting more of bandwidth and more of services, really as a wholesale service providers and telcos, the total industry is about 6.6% of the global telecommunications industry size is wholesale. So it's about a $142 billion business. And it's growing. It grew from 5.5% to 6.6%. But what's happening is that the wholesale provider is also going through a midlife crisis in a way that says, as a conventional telco, how do I move into the services area, because that's what's being asked of me. As a voice player or as a voice wholesaler, my voice revenues are continuing to be commoditized. And with the evolution of voice over LTE, that's the inflection point that will start making voice now become more of a data service rather than still be seen to ride on data and still be seen as a voiced call. And that's why we're seeing the voice revenues emerge and converge into the wholesale data area, which everybody's struggling with. So when we start looking at these service providers, they're saying, well, how do I build my business and I continue to remain relevant? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the slides to come. And as we emerge from the overall ecosystem, a service provider or a telco has two options. Either I build the infrastructure myself or I have a VNO that runs on top of it. But the initial starting point was, can I take my infrastructure, lease the infrastructure, whether it's a data center, it's co-location, or it's fiber assets, to then start offering capacity. Capacity on an actual usage, pay as you use, using technologies like Ethernet and IP transit, which ride on fiber. But increasingly, my own infrastructure with the capacity now also requires an element of partnership with a broader ecosystem for either content or other industry verticals that'll come up. But over the top players and e-commerce starts playing a role to deliver the increased connectedness in everything we do, whether it starts from health or it starts from connecting devices or sensors or the Internet of Things. All of that, capturing that into then serving the target market of the service, whether it's an enterprise or government or other service providers or consumers or bespoke solutions that are really taking us out outside of the telecommunication sphere of operations. But all of that says I have a traditional way of doing things, and then I'm being asked for a new way of doing things. So from transmission to submarine capacity to now providing IP services, Ethernet, content delivery networks as a service, and even becoming a cloud platform to deliver brokerage services to the new age customer. Okay, there we go. From co-location, looking at the old way of landing stations, exchanges, etc., to moving into data center services and the likes, and moving more from I need to own everything myself to look at sharing of the infrastructure we have, as well as leasing of towers, which is starting to create a huge shift in the mindset of how wholesale has started to evolve. You can actually go through the greatest thing that every service provider thought they had was access. Moving from the old XDSL to the last mile capability to really having a convergent, ubiquitous infrastructure around broadband over fiber or broadband over wireless, or call it any which way that I can connect the last mile, but no longer have it restricted to a few. So creating an open environment for other service providers to take advantage of infrastructure while you're continuing to deliver service to your target market. But then we have the old voice, the PSTN, to SIP trunks, to IP voice, and moving to voice over LTE. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the slides to come. But the voice landscape is forcing mobile operators to really look at voice in a very different way, considering its cannibalization from traditional voice to voice over LTE or IP voice. But we're seeing some other shifts, and the shifts coming into just the managed services arena, from the old IPLCs or the international private lease circuits to the NPLCs, as well as ATM, which are more expensive infrastructure, moving them to the new wave of services around a managed aggregated last mile services, managed aggregated core services. Can somebody come and run my core infrastructure for me better than I could do myself? Can I get scale in order to continue to bring down the unit price of how a service provider looks at delivering the end service? Do I need to own or do I need to lease? Do I need to have somebody deliver me the commoditized service levels, or do I actually need to deliver it myself? And in that, there is a whole scale of investment as well as resources in skill base that becomes relevant. But then what's driving these kind of changes? The first thing is, obviously, we're going mobile. The increased penetration of mobile in South Africa, we're exceeding 110-15% of penetration, but we're also seeing more smartphones starting to take a greater share in the percentage of devices moved. But it's not just smartphones. It's about the tablets, the phablets, and every other let that you can get that gives people the flexibility of mobility, but data as and when I need it, where I need it, with a common infrastructure. To then having had the device, but it's not just the physical device we as people carry, it's about the connectedness of things. Now we will find the plethora of sensor to sensor, machine to machine, people to people, and people to machine communications. It's going to put a huge demand on the infrastructure that is going to become necessary for service providers to start making sure that they're able to deliver to. You take mobiles and the devices, then you add the next element, which is video. Going into high definition video, which actually is big bandwidth consumption, and we see video taking an enormously large space in social media, as well as starting to increasingly take a huge focus in the B2B market, because video is now becoming a lot more pervasive, a lot more technology agnostic, and it's driving increased pressure on service providers to have an infrastructure that can cater to that. Now with the devices, the connectedness, and the video all coming together, now businesses have the opportunity to go global. And you can use X or cloud as a service in any shape or form. We can take it from a software as a service, or even to an extent of government as a service, and everything else that comes in between. Now that poses some very interesting challenges for service providers that then say, in all of these changing dynamics, how do we start changing ourselves so we remain relevant in the years ahead? So how would the landscape look in the year 2020? You'll have an environment where you'll have the consolidation of commodity players. So you'll see that happening not just domestically in South Africa, but around the world. You'll have some of the wholesale providers that will want to offer more and a broader set of services to their customers to remain relevant. Some will operate in a niche environment that says this is the market that I want to be the best in, and I will create a service levels where I will create market share and dominance in a certain niche. But we will also have equipment OEMs coming in and trying to create an outsourced services model for service providers to give them the scale and the lower unit cost on an ongoing basis. And then we will have, the greatest thing is that where is the delineation between the international boundaries and the domestic boundaries, and how do regulators deal with service providers extending beyond their current frame of operations in the geography, but really using the international capability to provide far better services, but also extend the reach to where their respective customers are growing. So as we look to service providers creating the infrastructure, huge capital investment, trying to remain relevant, am I engaging with where the market is growing, to then the advent of the over-the-top players. And to some examples, there are about 200 million emails that are sent out per minute. We're almost like an email world. Skype does 214 billion minutes of voice. Skype has seen about a 36% growth year on year in their volume coming through. Almost about 40% of the traffic of growth of voice that's coming about is being consumed by voice. But then you have beating Skype on the OTT game is people like WhatsApp, who now have about 2 billion messages a day. And if you look at those kind of players that are now challenging Skype's model, which Skype came up as an over-the-top, and then you have the likes of WhatsApp or Viber or Tango, just to show, and how many people use Viber? Viber? Okay, keep your hands. How many use Viber and Tango? Tango? WhatsApp? Okay, and Telegram? Some? All right, because these are some of the over-the-top apps that are now coming out where no longer do you need huge capital investment, lower capital investment, riding on top of somebody else's infrastructure and trying to make money out of it, or at least speculative money out of it. So what that's doing is that it's forcing conventional service providers to start thinking about, how do I deal with this OTT fellas and the guys that are coming to ride on my network? Do I fight them? Do I beat them, or do I join them? And we have models of all three happening. But to give you some examples of bobsled with T-Mobile, basically using, becoming an OTT player themselves while holding to the conventional models. We have other players, we have other players like BT, with BT Smart Talk and Telkomsel, and even O2 and 2Go. The predecessor was 2Me. Really creating models that says you can use your conventional mobile or landline tariff plans, but I will allow you to make calls from your desktop. And whatever calls you charge from your desktop, it'll be billed towards your tariff plan, and therefore you're able to have a single relationship with the service provider, but be able to straddle between the conventional telecommunications service provider model to the over-the-top model. So I'd rather try to keep the over-the-top model myself rather than having an over-the-top player come in and take some of the revenue streams and margins that are associated with it. Some geographies like China have restricted the OTT players in some shape or form. But then you have people like WeChat that are coming out and really taking like 300 million customers, where some of these players have only about 600,000 customers still. So it's about, how do I as a business and a service provider start dealing with the over-the-top player? Do I continue to fight, or do I join hands, or do I create a new model to start challenging even the over-the-top players in the realm of domain that they operate in? Which then leads to the next context, which is commoditization, which every service provider is fearing. How do I manage the concept of commoditization? Because I need to move up the value chain. So from the infrastructure to the data, to the core services, SMSs, voice data, all of these are getting commoditized when you go right up to the layer of the customer. And so somewhere, all service providers look at, how do I move up that value chain, to some other service providers saying, how do I start at the top and work my way down? And some are operating in the middle layer. But these are being driven by some trends. The trends around with Internet of Things, the on-demand services, ubiquity in devices and device management. Because of the plethora in devices across emerging now, open and somewhat closed, it's driving service providers to say, how do I remain relevant to that value stack that I want to participate in, because that's where I want to maintain my margins. But again, the drivers are people to people. Yes, that's given. But what about people to machine? Machine to machine. The sensor to sensor. So analysts predict, and Cisco predicts, that there will be about 50 billion sensor to sensor or devices connected on the internet by the year 2020. And coming from now to where we are, and the growth is immense. So how do service providers still remain relevant to that growth and deal with the investments necessary for the growth required? So the positioning on the landscape, that you can choose to remain an infrastructure player because I'm just unable to move into the next layer of value-add services. Unwilling, unable, don't have the capital, or don't have the wherewithal, or I just want to be a great utility player. To those who are wanting to become an enabler, moving into value-add services, capacity on growth, driving a larger ecosystem, to then going up to the digital world and playing at the layer of where the over-the-top players are working, as well as providing service levels to a far greater set of customers rather than being disintermediated. Now the challenge for the telecommunications service providers is, what are we good at? What is it that we want to operate in? Infrastructure, the mid layer, or the top, or all of the above? And each one has different dynamics for a service provider to look at creating the capability to remain relevant in that, because only a few will be good at all, but many will be good at some elements of it. So we don't have the answer for the future, but what I'd like to do is pose some questions about what are some of the questions we would be asking each other. If we look at asking ourselves, what's going to happen with voice in the future? Will it diminish and will it vanish? And will it then be integrated into a data layer that I can't see and I can't differentiate right now over a period of time? Will the difference between traditional and unified comms, and to what extent will unified comms, currently unified confusion, but unified comms start playing a role in how services are being delivered to customers? And really looking at, is fast broadband the only thing we have to talk about? Or is there a stack layer on top of broadband once that's delivered? To an integrated structure that then has questions of, should I be open? I open access, open devices, or do I have a closed environment and remain, keep my customers and my ecosystem confined? Or do I actually go into sharing, and do I have to build myself, or do I have to own? To then creating the crux of it of saying, am I really trying to deliver premium services, or is it premium value, or is it premium price, depending on which way we start looking at the operating model? Do I look at connecting people, or do I look at now connecting devices, which happen to be with people? And these are some of the questions that will govern how a service provider starts determining the path from where I am today to where I'm going to be in the future. But when we take that into a two-dimensional matrix on, you have growth on one axis, and you have consolidation to fragmentation at the other axis, you'll find that where you have a lesser number of players, you have a greater vertical play, and if growth is high, you'll have the clash of the giants coming in, which is brilliant to see because that drives competition. But where it starts getting fragmented and still growth is high in the market, you'll start saying it's a generative bazaar where you'll have smaller niche players emerging to take advantage of the growth opportunities coming about because of the fragmented nature of the industry. To then where you have declining growth and a consolidated environment, you're going to have an environment where it's survivor consolidation. And I think we'll see some bits and pieces of that in South Africa as it's happening. And then when it's fragmented and low growth, you're actually having a market shakeout where venture capitalists, private equity firms will take advantage of the opportunities on fire sale to be able to assist companies to reinvent themselves and really create an environment for service providers to remain relevant. So with all of that happening in the service provider world, between Neotel and Tata Communications, I know it was talked about that we're going through a little transaction, and I'll happily talk about it at the end, but where we look at ourselves is, in South Africa, Neotel has about 16,500 kilometers of national long distance, 9,000 kilometers of fiber in the metros. Combine that with the about 240,000 kilometers of fiber that Tata Communications has, and I'll show you a map around it, gives us a very unique capability to offer service providers an end-to-end service, a point-to-point or the whole end-to-end service. To us, delivering through the 5 submarine cable systems, Neotel is the only service provider in South Africa to have access to all 5 submarine cable systems as a consortium member, connected into Tata Communications' global submarine cable assets. To then being a Tier 1 ISP, Tata Communications is ranked number 4 in the world on Tier 1 ISPs, and Neotel is a Tier 1 ISP in South Africa, and you combine the 2 AS numbers, it gives a great user experience over the internet to the customers in the region, South Africa and the region. To then connect that with data centers, which we have 2 in South Africa and Joburg and Cape Town, but connected to 40 other data centers around the world. Now, if you take that in a pictorial representation, you say, if this is the fiber network that Neotel has, and you're right, we were number 2, we were the second network operator when we evolved 8 years ago, but we by far have gone into a serious drive on fiber optic investments, infrastructure investment in South Africa. And if you can see our spread and the structure of the fiber, every city has 3 diverse routes of fiber leaving the city to take care of uptimes, redundancy, etc. And the 5 submarine cable systems that connect South Africa to the world, to then connect that into Tata Communications' global infrastructure. And therefore giving us the unique capability where Tata Communications is the world's largest wholesaler of voice. We have about 60 billion minutes of voice that run on our backbone. And also the world's largest owner and operator of submarine cable systems. So we have about 240,000 kilometers of submarine cable system. But the value is that the only service provider then in the world that can do an around-the-world ring, primary and secondary, on our own controlled submarine cable network. So what it means to customers and service providers is that we can give you a redundant presence around the world in such a manner that, and I'll go through that thing, we can provide an infrastructure service which gives point-to-point, point-to-multipoint, Ethernet, layer 1, layer 2, which is box standard stuff, to give value-add services around a full IP infrastructure. Tata Communications network is MEF compliant, so from an Ethernet standpoint, give a complete MEF 9 and 14 compliance capability. Transit, but even on voice, we provide customers with either a transactional rate times minute. We can provide an interconnect service to 1,800 telcos around the world overnight, or do a fully managed voice infrastructure service with fraud prevention, as well as termination and managing the entire voice traffic for our customers. To moving up the value chain around the latest services around carrier aggregation. So the last mile aggregation is driving innovative commercial models to really help our service provider customers change the way they're doing business and allow them to reduce the unit costs, but still drive a far better service levels that we help the customers with. So when we start looking at saying, what is the value proposition that Neotel and Tata Communications can provide? Well, we can take a customer, service provider or enterprise or business customer across to 300 cities in 200 countries across 6 continents as a single source service provider with all that capability we can do. But the greatest thing we can do to our customers is partner with them. Because we know that the way of the future isn't the capability that I have built and we want to hold that, but it's more around partnering for growth. In our customers' growth, we see our growth as well. But in the context of where Neotel is headed to in South Africa, yeah, we're in the thick of a transaction with Vodacom. We're going through the regulatory approval process and the Competition Commission approval process, and that's expected to take a few months. We expect some part of early next year, some conclusion to come about that. But either which way, we see the capability that Neotel has is something that we can continue to offer to our wholesale customers as well as our B2B customers. And we're delighted to be part of this forum. And our booth is right around the corner. So if any of you have any questions or like to just have a discussion around some of your requirements, we'd love to see how we can serve you and enable you to become and remain relevant to your customers as we will then remain relevant to you. But with that, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciate your attention. Back to you.